our substitute for Jane Dutton, who has been called the best introducer on the planet. I won't do that, but our guest today deserves that kind of introduction. So this is the Pause Links session, first one in 2016. We're so glad you're here. For how many of you is this the first time you've attended a Pause Links session? Wow, that's terrific. Fantastic. So, 40% or so. That's great. This is a brand new space. I think this is the first time we've held any major event like this in this space. We held a faculty meeting in this space, but it's a brand new colloquium for us, so we're kind of initiating the space today. The Center for Positive Organizations is the sponsoring organization, and I've been told I need to introduce that slightly for us. So, the Center for Positive Organizations was created in 2001. It sort of fiddled along until we hired an executive director, Chris White, and a person in charge of the student activities, Betsy Irwin. And then it became a sort of world-class, spectacular organization where, wow, there's really interesting things going on. Huddles and sugar cubes and strength-based projects and celebrations and executive briefings, and at least 80 students, and a world-class Magnify program for students who get 6 credit hours in the summer. Anyway, it's this wonderful center now that has impact all over the world. In fact, one of the places that has impact is in the basketball team here at the university. The swimming team here at the university have all implemented positive practices that they've learned from the center. CEOs from China to South America to Indonesia, Pakistan, Europe, and all over the world have also been exposed to and are implementing these kinds of practices. The U.S. military for the last 12 years or so, at least, has a big immersion in positive organization practices. And one of the most exciting for us is my good friend and mentor, Bob Quinn, and I are spending time with the Detroit Public School System, which we intend eventually to write a case study showing this incredible transformation. If you can do it in Detroit, you can do it anywhere. So we're proud of the work you all are doing to make this really spectacular kind of a place. And it's the sponsor of and the organizing mechanism for having this Pause Links session. Now, the person we've invited to kick off this year is literally, this is absolutely sincere, one of my most favorite psychologists on the planet. She has written the most fascinating work, I think. She's written about the writings of dead, famous psychologists, right? She's written about love song writers and singers. I mean, when you sing a love song that has bad messages, or, my dog died, my wife left me, and that kind of stuff, you die sooner. It's not the writer that dies sooner, it's the singer that dies sooner. And today, really interesting work on smiles and smiling. So Sarah Pressman graduated, got her degree at Carnegie Mellon University, now is at the University of California at Irvine, has her own lab, does really interesting projects, lots and lots of projects underway. But you'll be really interested in what she has to say today. She studies stress, but and other things, positive emotions and so on. But cardiovascular response, immune system change, sleeping, exercise, leisure, hormone reactivity. She had a fellowship in cardiovascular behavioral medicine. I mean, this is a person who is a psychologist on the one hand, but really, really fascinating person, I think, and a wonderful human being. So with no more introduction than that, I hope that's enough, Sarah, we are really pleased that you're here, and you'll love it. So, Sarah Pressman.
I'm I'm so thrilled to be here. I was telling someone else this morning that that University of Michigan is the first American university I ever saw. When I was 6 years old, I grew up in Canada, and my dad drove me here, and I was like, okay, this is what an American university looks like. And so it's the standard since I've been 6 of what a university should be. No pressure to the other universities out there, because I don't think very many are this beautiful. So it definitely set a high standard. But I'm so grateful to be here, to be the first person to launch off this really excellent series. Someone posted on Twitter, with a smile, start your semesters with a smile. And I'm really grateful that you gave up this beautiful sunny day to learn about smiling with me today. It's a relatively new topic that I've become interested in the last few years, but the reason I really wanted to talk about this with all of you is that this is a very interdisciplinary group. I don't often get a chance to talk to people from business, from medical schools, and people from organizations, from the community. It's such a diverse group, and I think that a lot of diverse people should be interested in smiling, and I'm going to use 2 major ways to try to convince you of this today. So the first way I'm going to try to convince you of it is more from a research perspective, but I think it also has to do a lot with those of you interested in kind of counseling or applying positive psychology, applying positive topics to your work, and that's the question of how almost all of us study positive stuff. You know, so if we're interested in well-being, we want to make our workplace happier, we want to make our lives happier, we want to understand if we're happy, what's the way we almost always test if someone is happy? You can yell it out. What do we do? No, we don't smile. We typically ask you, right? You fill out one of those silly online surveys. If you're a psychologist, we give you like a 10-page questionnaire. We ask you, how happy are you? How excited are you? How satisfied with your life are you? We ask you. Like, I would hazard to say maybe 95% of work on well-being is done by asking people how much well-being they have. And that's not a bad thing, but it is a little bit of maybe a simple and sometimes problematic view, because I think we need to pause a little bit on what it means to ask people these questions and to rely almost entirely and solely on self-report questionnaires. And that's because with self-report, there's actually quite a few issues that happen when you ask someone the question, how happy are you, from 0 to 10. There's issues in psychology that we study a lot, like response biases. So if you've ever filled out one of these questionnaires and you didn't really want to fill it out, you might have done something like 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, right? You've probably seen this and you're just not paying attention. So it might be that you're lying. It might be that you're not paying attention, you're exhausted, and you've got survey burnout. But it could also be a response style, which is that some people just tend to put themselves in the middle. Other people tend to always put themselves at the end. I am a 10 on intelligence. I am a 10 on attractiveness. And other people might be always 1, 1, 1. And so because of that, we might not be able to always trust these self-reports to be completely accurate. And then on top of that, I think one issue with positive emotion, positive psychology specifically, is that sometimes we might be a little bit concerned that we want to present ourselves in a certain way. And so we don't want to say that we're depressed. We don't want to say that we're unhappy. We want to say that we're very positive people. And so that might play in as well. Now, there's certainly ways around this, ensuring anonymity in our surveys, asking them in clever ways. But really, because of these kinds of issues, researchers for a long time have advocated that we don't just use self-report. But we kind of still do. But there are these other ways of getting at well-being and studying it in a really interesting way using these other arrows beyond just self-report, which I think is, can you see the green dot? Oh, it doesn't show up. Beyond the self-report, which is simply just one way. So why smiling? There's a lot of other observational things we could do. We could code people's behavior. We might ask a friend how happy you are. So why is smiling maybe something to think about? Well, one thing is that it's pretty easy to identify if someone is smiling or not smiling. But we're actually going to go further than that today. So there's some people have argued dozens and dozens and dozens of different kinds of smiles, but mostly we identify smiles in one of 2 ways, and that's to look at if it's a sincere smile or a genuine smile, which we also call a Duchenne smile, based on the person who first researched this, versus what we call pleasantly a social smile, a standard smile, but other people might more negatively call it a fake smile. So if we're looking at these pictures, can you identify which A or B is the fake smile versus the sincere smile? A is which one? The fake smile, right. So on both sides. So what's the difference? It's the eyes, right. It's in the eyes. So the difference between a sincere smile is that it has orbicularis oculi activity, which is the muscles that we sometimes, you might call like crow's feet, the little wrinkles we get around our eyes, if you see those, that's actually an indication that someone is smiling sincerely at you. Obviously, as you get older, those are almost always there, but they'll be deeper when you're smiling. I was actually just having a conversation about Botox, but that's a whole other question to talk about after. But it makes it very easy for us to study because we can just look, and you don't need to be well-trained to do this. You can really see this relatively easily and train a research assistant in a matter of a few hours to tell the difference between a Duchenne smile and a non-Duchenne smile. So it's just simply easy. And then on top of that, it's also really easy to tell if someone's not smiling, right? This is not hard. We know if someone's not smiling. We know if they're very serious. We know if they're frowning. We know if they're angry. So it just becomes a very simple way of studying this. Now the question is, of course, is smiling really telling us anything about well-being? And there's countless research on this topic. Of course it is. So there's research that's done, neuroimaging studies to show that when people Duchenne smile, it activates the same areas of the brain that a real positive emotion would activate. There's research that happy people smile more. There's research that if we show you like a happy video, you smile. None of this should be too surprising to you. I think intuitively we know that smiling really does represent positive emotion. And so I think really what's going on with smiling is that it's a way of us getting at positivity without having to ask you about it. And I think that's actually a really good thing. Now, the one thing that's also to our advantage is that we're getting better at coding faces in even more complex ways. So if you want to look at facial expression beyond positive emotion and really understand people's emotional experiences, which again is a bit outside what we'll talk about today, you used to have to do fax coding, which is a very complicated, weeks-long course to code every single action unit of the face, and there's lots and lots and lots of them, and this takes a very, very long time. But with the advent of really excellent computer vision and computer technology, we now have a lot of competing companies that can do this for you. And so if you're interested in really precise emotion measurement, you can just put it through a computer, and there's some great companies doing it already, so that you can have all of your data processed in a matter of moments. So really this is becoming easier. So I think it's worth exploring for those reasons alone. But you might want more reasons. So let's start with the first one that I think is interesting, which is whether or not smiling actually is associated with anything important. I'm a health psychologist. I think things like longevity, how sick you get, those things are important topics, and so let's start there. Now, if we have any grad students in the audience, one thing that I realized, Kim mentioned that I did a project on dead psychologists as a grad student. The reason that was a great topic as a graduate student is that population, it was archival data. All those people were already dead. It was very easy to study them. And it's the same thing with photos, or with smiling, because you can use archival data on photos that have smiles in them, code them, and then follow up and see various outcomes, 30, 40, 50 years later, depending on the yearbook photo. Everyone has access to yearbooks. Everyone has access to archival photos. And so this is a really nice way as a grad student of getting some data from people a long time ago that you could study now. And so I think it's just a really nice method. And so one of the earliest studies using photos of smiling, and it's a great study, was done by Harker and Keltner in 2001. And what they did is they tracked some yearbooks from women and coded their smiles. So is it a sincere smile? Is it a fake smile? And looked at currently how satisfied were they with their marriage? Were they still married? Had they been married? Were they divorced? How much well-being did they have? And they showed that the smile that these women had 30 years ago in their yearbook was associated with how happy they were with their marriage and also how happy they were in general. Great study. And any of you could do this study, right? You just need to track down some people's yearbooks. Similarly, there was a really clever study on baseball card photos, and they did, an Abel and Kruger in 2010, looked at the facial expressions and how much of a smile there was in baseball cards from many, many years ago, looked 60 years later, and showed that those individuals who had a sincere smile in their baseball card had a 8-year advantage to how long they lived versus those individuals who were not smiling. And so it explained about 35% of the variability in lifespan. So this is a huge effect, and it's such a nice, easy way of looking at positivity and how it predicts longevity, or in the marriage study, just well-being. So what we took from this is, okay, these are all fairly long studies of a long time period. What about right now? So if I had you all take out your driver's licenses, I'm not going to make you do this, and you looked at the photo of how much you're smiling in your driver's license or in your Michigan student ID, and we looked at whether or not you were smiling, would that have the same kind of health or well-being impact that those other studies had? So we did this with students, and we literally just pulled their student ID photos. And there is variability. Some people don't want to smile in their student ID photo, and some people do. And so there was huge variability there. Most people smile in some way, but I'd say about a third of the people don't smile. And we can't look at longevity in undergrads, but what we can look at is how often they go to the doctor. And so in this study, we just tracked over the last year how frequently were they going to visit a doctor. And that's usually considered bad, right? So if you're going to the health center, it's probably because you're sick, you got a cold, you got a flu. And so would the people who were smiling be less likely to go to the doctor? So my graduate student, Marie Cross, ran a study on this, got 250 students' ID photos. And we're going to compare the non-smile groups to the smile groups, so the gray bar on the left. And surprisingly, and to my shock, it was the opposite effect. So if you look at people who are smiling in their student ID photo, what we actually found is that those individuals who were doing a standard smile were 6 times more likely to go to the doctor than the people who weren't smiling in their student ID photo. And the Duchenne group was about 3.5, 4 times more likely. And so a researcher who gives up early would say, oh my gosh, smiling doesn't matter. Smiling is bad for you. We should give up on smiling. But we did not do that. We said, okay, there's a lot of different reasons that we go to a doctor, and not all of them are bad. In fact, in some cases, it's good. It's preventative, right? Sometimes we go to the doctor for checkups. We go for vaccines. We go because we need to take care of a chronic condition. And so could it be the case that the people smiling are going more often because they're going for preventative reasons as opposed to going for these reasons like you're sick, you broke an arm, you have a mental health concern that you need help with? And we split up in a new study, why did you go to the doctor? So what is it that made you go to the medical center? And when we did this, lo and behold, we have completely different results. And so if we look at illness, standard smile, so the no smiling group is there as a comparison. We're not showing it, but everything is compared to that. But there's no difference, so those are not significant. Injury, no difference. Those are not significant. Mood disorder, no difference. None of those matter. None of those are significant. Preventative, huge difference. And so what was driving that first study's finding is that people who smile in their ID photos are, in this study, this was a new study of 430 people, that the individuals who are Duchenne smiling are 3.5 times more likely to be taking care of themselves, which is very cool because a lot of the work I do is on positive emotion and health. Why do happy people live longer? Well, maybe it's because they take better care of themselves. And for college students, I know we have some undergrads and grad students in the room, they don't take very good care of themselves on average. You almost only go to the doctor on average because you're sick and you've got the flu or something. So this is a really, really good thing. This really means that even at age 20, 25, you're already taking better care of yourself if you're smiling. So that was a very cool finding. There was no difference between the smiling groups, even though it looks like there was. Okay, so photos are great. These are a great source of data, but we can actually look at naturally occurring smiles as well, and that seems to be important as well. Now, for those of you who are interested, there's some interesting things to think about with what does it mean to smile in a photo, what's driving those effects. We can talk about those later in the snack hour afterwards. So in the laboratory, Barb Fredrickson and Bob Levinson, they did a study where they were doing something completely different on emotion induction and how emotion induction altered stress, but they were smart enough to collect data on did the person spontaneously smile during the stressful experience that they were putting them through. And they found that those who did, they weren't manipulating it. If you just spontaneously smiled during stress, you had better cardiovascular responses following that stressor, just naturally smiling. Also related to cardiovascular responses, Karina Davison did a study where she had nurses who, when they were doing patient intake in a longitudinal heart study, they just had them code, was the patient smiling? How much were they smiling while you interacted with them? And the patients who were smiling, when they followed up with them 10 years later, had a 22% reduction in heart disease just because they were smiling at that first interaction with their nurse practitioner who was intaking them. So very cool and impressively strong effects in some of these studies. So when we think about mechanism, what's going on? Why are these people who are naturally smiling in interactions, naturally smiling in stress, naturally smiling in photos, what is it that is making them live longer, have fewer heart disease, have less heart disease, things like that? And what we really think is going on is that it's just a marker of positive affect. There's a huge literature, this is what I mostly study, showing all the different reasons that people who are happy have better health, things like different levels of stress hormones, better immune systems, they exercise more, they sleep better, better relationships, lots and lots of reasons. And so the reasons that smiles are good for you are probably just because it's tapping into whatever positive emotion is doing. It's just an external marker of positive emotion. So in that case, arguing for why we should use smiles, it's entirely just because it's an easy substitute for studying positive emotion. Great. Faster than a survey, good and easy to get archival data. But there's another way of thinking about this. So I told you I was going to give you 2 reasons to study smiling. And the other reason I think that's really interesting to study smiling is that sometimes we don't think it's an indicator of positive affect. Sometimes we actually think that it is a predictor of positive affect. So what do we mean by this? So some of you might be familiar with this psychological theory called the facial feedback hypothesis. Has anyone heard of this before? Not very many. Okay, interesting. Great. I get to teach you. So this is a really, really, really famous theory in psychology. It's been, this concept has actually been around way longer than the 1970s when the hypothesis was stated. Darwin had this idea. And it's this idea that if you fake, have you ever heard of fake it till you make it? It's that. So the idea is that even if you're faking an emotion, simulating it will arise, it'll make it, as Darwin put it, arouses it in your mind. And so faking an emotion can somehow generate that feeling for real. It'll eventually really happen. And so in 1979, that theory was established, but really, the most important study that was done on it was a few years later where, and I'll show you the example of it, where they showed that if we experimentally assign smiles, even if you don't know that you're smiling, that we can see what smiling does. So the early work on this was really hard to do because if you tell someone to smile, they know they're smiling, and so that might have some kind of weighty reasons of, well, maybe I don't want to smile or stop telling me what to do, but maybe we can trick you into smiling, and then we would really understand if it's the smiling itself that's causing some of these effects. And so the early study that's sort of considered the seminal study in facial feedback was done by Strack in 1988. And what he did is he told the students who came in, the subjects who came in, that it was a study on quadriplegics who had to use their mouths to do other tasks. So they had to use their mouth because they couldn't use their arms or legs. And so they wanted to test how using your mouth while doing other tasks affected you. And the trick was, I don't think I have a pen here, but if you have a pen with you, maybe I'll borrow one from here. I'm going to put it in my mouth, so you don't want me to lend yours. Okay, so the trick here is that if you look at this group, what facial expression does that look like? A smile, right? And it's all that they told them is, please hold it with your teeth, like that, versus the other group, please hold it with your lips, which is like the groups on top. And the group on top, what emotion is that? It's more negative, right? And so you don't know you're smiling, you don't know you're frowning, and then they had them rate Far Side cartoons for how funny they thought they were and for how much joy they brought them. And lo and behold, the group who was smiling, even though they didn't know it, thought they were funny. So this, or funnier. So this had a huge impact on psychology. This is in every psychology textbook. It's a huge theory. But one of the reasons why I really want to talk about smiling today is that while I was on vacation a few weeks ago, disaster happened, which was, in psychology, we've been going through this, something called a replication crisis, where people are trying to replicate famous psychology studies. 17 research labs tried to replicate that Strack study and failed. And so some of them it worked, some of them it didn't, but when you looked overall, nothing. And so this has resulted in a lot of people saying, this is the end of smiling. Like, let's not study it. It's not worth it. We should throw away all the facial feedback studies, which is a bit of an extreme response because there are literally thousands of studies on this concept of facial feedback about how, if we do Botox, it can alter your emotional experiences by blocking the activity of those muscles. There's work on social relationships and how you mimic and how that makes you feel closer. There's so much on smiling, and they just want to throw it out. And I really wanted to spend some time in this talk explaining that there's a lot more that facial feedback can be doing beyond this one single dependent variable that failed in terms of the replication. Which is this outcome of how much joy do you get from reading a Far Side cartoon. So if we made it more broad, we could say, okay, positive emotion. But I think that facial feedback and what it does when you smile is having a much bigger effect than just positive emotion even. And so we're going to talk about some of those studies today and what all the different ways that smiling seems to be altering behavior, stress, and other outcomes that might have nothing to do with happiness. And so I think that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. But if you've been paying attention, the other thing, and just to dig a little bit into that Strack study, I don't want to go too far, there is one thing you might notice from this replication. So what kind of smile are they making in this photo? Is that a sincere smile? No, right? And so it's a bit weird to think about the idea that this early study, why did it even work? Because if they weren't sincerely smiling, why would you think that a cartoon is more funny if you're fake smiling? Fake smiling does not make us happier. There's lots of research on it. If you look at your Starbucks barista who's fake smiling at you, she's probably not that happy, right? And that's because fake smiles don't do much for us, but real smiles do. And so we already realized this a few years ago when we ran a study on stress and we added a condition. And so we used the Strack condition. We're actually using disposable chopsticks. We thought it was more hygienic than using a pen. So disposable chopsticks, neutral condition, happy condition, or fake smile condition, and Duchenne smile condition, where they had to hold the chopsticks sideways and push it back as far back as possible, which ends up activating their cheeks in a way that activates the orbicularis muscles around your eyes. So there's crow's feet activity here. And what we did is we were interested, based on the Barbara Fredrickson study, which found that like spontaneously smiling helped you. If we manipulate you to smile and you don't know that you're smiling, will that help you with stress? And so we put people through what all of us fun health psychologists do, some pretty nasty stressors. The first one, which those of you who live in Michigan, this isn't so bad, but you have to put your hand in near freezing water for a minute. I know we can all handle that. Just jump in Lake Michigan for a little bit, you'll be fine. So it's painful, it's uncomfortable, but we had them do that while they were holding chopsticks in their mouths, thinking that they were doing this multitasking study. And what we saw is that when they had their hand in the ice bucket and then pulled it out, the stressor was over. If you were in the Duchenne smiling condition, the red line, your heart rate recovered faster than those individuals who were in the sort of social fake smile group, the green line, and also the individuals who were in the control group, so the non-smiling group. Their heart rate was going faster. And that's really impressive. So cardiovascular recovery from a stress is actually a really important predictor. It predicts things like future heart disease. And so just by smiling, even if you don't know it, was helping you get over that stressor. We actually replicated it with a completely different stressor, which is something called a star tracing task. It's more of a performance-based task where you had to trace a picture of a star, which doesn't sound too bad. You can't see your hand. You have to use a mirror, so everything's kind of backwards. And every time you go off the star line, it buzzes at you and counts your mistakes. And we tell them you can only make a few mistakes. And so it's extremely anxiety-provoking. And we make them do it for a couple of minutes. And then as soon as it's over, monitor their heart, well, I actually monitor their heart rate throughout, but we had them doing that while, again, they were holding the chopsticks in their mouths in these different conditions. And once again, you see the same effect, which is as soon as the stressor was over, so this is 90 seconds after the stressor was over, and then plus 90, so 180 seconds, and 270, and so forth, that their heart rate drops faster if they're Duchenne smiling versus if they're smiling versus if they're in the control group. And you can see with the control group, they never get as low in their heart rate as the other groups do in that 5 minutes or so that we followed them up. Now, if we think about this from the Strack perspective, which was all about positive emotion, you might ask the question, did positive emotion drive this effect? Is it that they were happier and that's why it worked better? And the answer is no. It didn't have anything to do with positive emotion. We saw a little bit of an effect where the people who were smiling, surprisingly, were happy even though their hand was in ice water, but it didn't mediate it. And so there could be something that smiling is doing that has very little to do with positive emotion, which again makes the Strack finding maybe not so scary that it didn't replicate. Now, we followed this up by saying, okay, ice water, star tracer, not very realistic stressors. Let's take this into the real world where people have stressors that something you might actually experience in your day-to-day life. And the thing we came up with is getting a shot. So hopefully all of you are getting your flu vaccine and various vaccines that you're supposed to be getting. And what we know is that that's a very short-term, painful stressor that maybe we can make a little bit better by having them smile. And the reason why we thought this was especially good is that people naturally sometimes smile when they're getting a shot. It's sort of this weird gut reaction. But more commonly, they do this expression. Do you guys know what this expression is? It's a grimace. And so a grimace looks surprisingly kind of like a Duchenne smile, right? You see activation In the cheeks, you see activation in the orbicularis oculi. The big difference is you've got the negative emotion happening too. The corrugator between your eyebrows is also activated. So it's negative emotion, but it activates some of the same muscles. And the one thing that it really helps us deal with is that people have argued, well, maybe this works because it's just distracting. This is going to be equally distracting. And so we added that condition where they were also grimacing. This is actually my former honor student, Katie, who did her public health degree at Michigan, but she's not here anymore. And so we added that condition and said, okay, what does that do if we assign you to have one of those conditions while you get a needle? And so here's what that looked like. So they practiced the expression for a couple minutes. They rated how much pain they thought the needle would be. They then got it. Oh, and if you're curious, the needle is the same gauge as a flu vaccine gauge, which is about a 25 gauge needle. It was just salt water. We weren't giving them any kind of drug. They then rated how painful the needle was, and then they also rated how painful it was after the fact, and we monitored their heart rate throughout. Here's just some pictures of what that looked like. So you can see the needle on the side, on the corner for both of them in two different conditions. And so the question we'll look at is, did smiling help you experience less pain while you got a needle? And lo and behold, it had a really nice, powerful, clinically important effect, which is that if you were in the neutral group versus if you were in the grimace group or the Duchenne smiling group, you rated your pain during that needle quite a bit lower, and it was actually a 40% reduction in pain just by smiling. And again, you don't know you're smiling. Now you can see the grimace group was also equally effective, right, at that point. And in the recovery pain, it was even more effective, although that difference wasn't significant. And so grimacing, we kind of have a reason now. Why do people grimace in pain? Because it works, right? It makes you feel better. It makes it hurt a little bit less. But here's where the difference happens. If we look objectively at what their heart rates were doing while they were getting that needle, again, we would expect it to go up because needles hurt and it's stressful. What you see is that the Duchenne group is now doing the best. Their heart rate went up the least, and it dropped the fastest. Next was the standard smile group. And then the neutral group, you can't even see, and that's because it's the purple line that's kind of hidden, and in the back, I'm sure you can't see that. But essentially, the neutral group and the grimace group looked identical. And I had to check my data like 10 times to believe this, because essentially what we saw is that even though grimacing makes you feel less pain, no objective cardiovascular benefit for you. It's really smiling that makes you have less of a stress response. And so we thought that was just incredible. So that study's under review right now at PNAS. So fingers crossed, all of you fingers crossed, and we'll see if that gets accepted. So again, we can ask the question, okay, so it's facial feedback, it's positive facial feedback. Is it happiness that drove this effect? No. So there's something else going on here that's helping people feel less stress, helping people feel less pain. We also had anxiety ratings, we also had stress ratings, and none of it was driven by feeling more positive. And so there's something more to smiling going on. And so it's altering your arousal maybe, it's altering your stress. And we started wondering, okay, well, could this ever be bad? So are there behavioral outcomes where maybe in some cases you want stress to be a signal, you want to feel stressed, you want to feel arousal. And the thing that we started wondering about was in these moral dilemmas, stress can be a signal, right? Arousal can be a signal that I'm about to do something wrong. And because we work with students, the thing we initially thought of was cheating, right? So one of the reasons, why don't our students constantly cheat? It's because they feel guilty, right? It's that arousing sort of like, oh my God, I shouldn't cheat, I might get caught, this is wrong. Well, what if we get rid of that because they're smiling? So we use something called the chance to cheat paradigm, and I should say up front, doing this work on morals and cheating, this is really outside of my wheelhouse as a health psychologist, and so I've been working really closely with Pete Ditto at UCI, who's a political and moral psychologist, so it's been really helpful. But what we did is we brought students in and we gave them something called the chance to cheat paradigm, and we make them do a set of not difficult but kind of annoying math problems. And so this is an example of one. So you should all hopefully be able to do this. 19 plus 5 plus 12 plus 13 minus 9 and so forth. And we would tell them that they were going to do a bunch of these and that we had some greater purpose of studying math skills and how it relates to psychology. And the RA, who's kind of young and timid, says, I'm really, really sorry. You can hear my Canadian accent when I say sorry. But there's something wrong with the computer today. I can't figure it out. But what we need you to do is as soon as you see the math problem, please press the space bar because there's this weird glitch. And if you don't press it, the answer eventually shows up on the screen. So do me a favor and press the space bar as soon as you see the problem. And so cheating would be you don't press the space bar, right? And the answer shows up in the corner a few seconds later. Now, the trick is after they have to answer their answer. And so the way we know if they cheated or they didn't is that this answer is wrong. And so it's only off by like 1 or 2. And so if they did the calculations quickly in their head, they probably wouldn't notice. And so the way we define cheating was, did you ever put in the wrong answer, essentially? And then we also monitor how long did it take you to press the space bar, because the longer you're delaying, the more you're thinking about cheating. And what we did is we did the same manipulation. So Duchenne smiling, we got rid of the fake smiling because we see that Duchenne smiling always works better. And contrast that with control. Tell them they're in a multitasking study. We're looking at how multitasking affects cheating. Well, not cheating, math problem, math ability. And look at the outcome. And what we found is that in the control group, 57% of the people cheated at least once. But in the smiling group, 72% of the people cheated at least once. If we look at how long they took to think about it, the people who were in the smiling group waited longer to press the space bar. So even if they didn't cheat in that condition and that question, they were at least thinking about cheating in that condition. And it's in the direction that you would expect if smiling is reducing your arousal, reducing the stress, reducing the guilt of cheating, right? It's enabling you to cheat, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it's really, really interesting. And so we've been following this up. We're actually doing a replication right now, but we're also trying to follow this up by understanding, okay, why? So was it positive emotion in that condition? Is it like the Strack study where they were happier and happiness made them cheat more? No, the only thing we saw was stress. And so what you see is that from the beginning to the end, those people who were in the experimental group, they had a drop in stress by the end of the study. So those are the ones who cheated, right? So the cheaters actually are feeling, well, at least some of them, so the smilers were less stressed at the end of the study. And again, there were 75% of them had cheated at least once. And then those who were in the control condition, who much less of them, many fewer of them cheated, they were actually more stressed by the end of the study, which really suggests smiling is doing something to our stress. So really, really interesting, compelling data. And positive emotion, not part of it. So the question is smiling really about a moral behavior? Is it encouraging you to behave morally? Is it, you feel better, you feel less stress, and so, you're happy to behave in maybe this slightly unethical way? Or is it really more about the willingness to kind of take on risk? And so cheating is a bit of a risky thing. You might get caught. You might feel bad about it. And so is it more about just you're willing to do these riskier things because that decrease in arousal, that decrease in stress makes it seem not as scary? And this is data that we're in the process of collecting. So we're only about halfway through, but I peeked. Don't tell anyone, including YouTube people. Don't tell anyone. But we peeked at our data for the purposes of this. Oh. Someone was watching. We peeked at the data to see whether or not risk behavior was different in people smiling versus not. We've only got about 65 people at this point, and I could not believe this data when I saw it. So this is a kind of standard economic decision risk-taking task where we tell someone, if I was going to just pick your preference, would you rather receive $250 right now, or $240 actually, guaranteed, going to give you $240, or do you want to take a risk and there's a 75% chance that you get nothing, but a 25% chance that I'm going to give you $1,000? So which do you take, the guarantee or the high-risk, sort of high-reward choice? And I cannot believe this data because when you look at this, basically no one in the control group that was not smiling took the risky choice. But 30% of the people in the smiling group took it. So it's a tenfold difference in how often people are making risky decisions just by smiling. And again, they don't even know they're smiling. So this is really quite incredible in my view. I think it's exciting how easy it was to manipulate that. So because I'm working with a moral psychologist, they wanted to take this into kind of the standard moral psychology realm, which if you've ever taken a philosophy course, you might be familiar with these things called trolley problems. Has anyone heard of these? See a couple of nods. So these are these kind of like philosophical, ethical dilemmas that we sometimes have students evaluate or research subjects evaluate where, and I think this will sound familiar once you hear it. So you tell someone you're standing by a train track or a track of some kind, and the train is out of control, it has no brakes, or the trolley in this case has no brakes, and it's about to hit someone on the track. So maybe there's a worker, a construction worker. But there's also a track, oh sorry, I said it wrong. So it's about to hit, out of control, 5 people or 4 people. So I think usually it's about 5 on the track. And you're by a switch, and you can pull the switch and make it leave this track and go onto this track and only kill 1 person instead. So what's the right decision? Do you make it kind of take fate and say, okay, it was about to hit those 5 people, I'll let it hit the 5 people, or do you pull the lever, killing this other person who wouldn't have died? But it's kind of the more utilitarian decision because fewer people will die. So what do you do? Similarly, also an out-of-control trolley. Trolleys apparently get out of control regularly. You're on a footbridge over a track, and there's an out-of-control trolley. It's going down, and there's 5 people on the track that are about to get killed by this out-of-control trolley. But you're standing next to a large person. Do you throw them off the bridge in front of the trolley to stop it so that it only kills 1 person instead of 5 people? These are real moral problems that philosophers apparently think about. I'm a health psychologist, so I'm going to clarify that. And so our question was, so these are assessed very commonly to try to understand moral decision making and how people make these kinds of choices, but we wanted to look at it in the context of these manipulated smiles. So would smiling alter how you make these kinds of ethical decisions or moral decisions? And what we found is that individuals who were smiling were more likely to take the utilitarian choice, which was do the maybe aversive thing of pushing someone off a bridge and killing them, but in the process saving 5 lives, or killing someone who shouldn't have died, but again saving 5 lives. And so you've got this net benefit of 4 people living who weren't going to, or 4 people living instead of 5 people living instead of one dying. And so it's interesting. It's not the same as cheating, right? This is not an immoral thing. It's really more about how you make your decisions for the greater good. And what it seems to be happening here is that people who are smiling are making this utilitarian choice to save the most people, even if it's kind of an aversive thing to do. A lot of people would say, hey, I'm not pushing that person, that's murder, I'm killing someone. But they're making this choice, which is maybe something that is arousing and is stressful, to save the most people. And so it really creates this sort of interesting spectrum of different kinds of behaviors that something as simple as a smile seems to be altering. And so the question then, of course, is what's driving this, right? Because it doesn't seem to be positive emotion. Because we've tested positive emotion in almost every one of these studies. Sometimes it goes up with smiling, as we would expect, but it's not mediating these effects. And the effects are really broad, risk-taking, stress, moral decisions, really broad. And so I think it raises, just a host of research ideas that people could start testing to try to understand what smiling is doing. Now, as someone who's very interested in physiology, I will say there's some really interesting physiological pathways that could be happening that have nothing to do with emotion. And so the principle of facial feedback is that there's nerves in your face that when you activate a muscle, it sends a message back to your brain. And that's always been the premise of facial feedback. But the idea was that nerve, which is the afferent trigeminal nerve, that it was going to the emotion area of your brain and making you happier. But there's also the possibility that it has nothing to do with emotion, or it's bypassing emotion, or it's convergent with emotion, maybe 2 different pathways, that it's going directly to these physiological and autonomic parts of your brain that control your stress reactivity, and that's why we're having these benefits. That it's something about reduced arousal when we smile. It's something about reduced stress that is physiologically happening potentially without emotion being involved at all. And it's really, really exciting. We're just starting to do this work now to try to understand this. But, physicians have known about this kind of connection for a long time. There's something called the oculocardiac reflex. And if you have a patient having a really high coronary event, a high heart response, you can actually decrease it by just rubbing their eyes. They do ocular massage, and it drops their heart rate. And so this has been happening for a while because we know that eye muscle activity has direct connections to your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relax, digest part of your body, and also your sympathetic nervous system, which is the sort of stress part. And so there's some really exciting reasons to think that the smiling could be having these really direct effects on our physiology. So, message. Let's not kick smiling to the curb. And I say this more to people who read. There have been a few articles that are very against smiling now because of what happened with this replication that says, hey, let's throw out this research area. It's clearly not working. Every time something fails to replicate, they want to get rid of the whole research area. But there's clearly some really interesting things going on. And I think what really this kind of turning point in a research area gives the opportunity is to think about what are the right research questions and clinical questions and applications we should be thinking about. And there's a lot. So I think a really important one is how much is positive emotion involved in facial feedback? And really thinking about when does it work, when doesn't it work? I think we should also be thinking about whether or not the pathways of smiling being associated with photographs with well-being, what are the pathways there? I think they're probably completely different. I think that why smiling in a photograph would be good for you has a lot more to do with just how happy you are, which does have to do with stress. but it's not the direct physiological pathways we're talking about. I don't think that if you smile in a photograph today and it drops your heart rate, that's predicting how long you live. It's more about how much you smile in general and what that has to do with your trait affect. So two very different questions, two different pathways. I think there's a lot of work to be done to understand when facial feedback works and when it doesn't. Clearly it's not always going to have these effects, but instead of throwing it away, let's think about how we can use this and when we can use this. And then even more importantly, I think from the perspective of people here who want to work with organizations, who want to bring this into practice, how can we use this, right? How can we use this information to help intervene in the real world and make people less stressed, more willing to make risky financial decisions? Maybe that's not such a good thing. Maybe we want to have people have a still face or a straight face when they're making decisions about stock market. But there's certainly a lot for us to do to really explore this. Now, I will say the industry is really already on board with this. There's actually a company in Detroit called the Smile Stick Company, and you can put their website here. It's thepowerofsmiling.com, where they are already on board, think that we should just basically be handing out sticks to people, encouraging them to smile all the time. Whether or not that's the right decision, I think that's a little bit early, but I certainly think that the area is ripe to do work. And clearly smiling has a wide range of effects on stress and physiology, on behavior, that is worth exploring and trying to understand how we can use it to really improve the lives of people and even just make a shot hurt less, which I think is good for all of us who have ever had a needle. So with that, I will thank all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of undergrads and graduate students and faculty who have worked on this work at UC Irvine, where I am now, and also University of Kansas, where I was at the beginning. And I'll thank you for joining me and spending this afternoon learning about smiling. So thank you.
So we certainly have time for questions. Would you just like to monitor your own questions?
Sure, unless
Great.
you want to pick.
Questions, issues, comments, yeah buts, cranky smiles, genuine smiles, Duchenne smiles.
Yeah, there's one there.
Okay, there you go.
Just wondering if you or anyone in your group has done any work with the association between smiling and laughing.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Not so much. I mean, really, there's a whole research area on laughter and why laughter is good for us. It's also very much tied to cardiovascular things. So there's been some studies showing that your carotid arteries open up when you're laughing, and people who laugh more sort of have wider arteries, which prevents, for those of you not familiar, it's good for stroke outcomes and cardiovascular outcomes. And a lot of people who study laughing think of it more as kind of like brief internal exercise. And so the same way that exercise is good for you because it kind of trains your cardiovascular system to go up and down, that's why laughter is good for you. And so there's a whole host of research on like humor being associated with good health outcomes, on laughter being associated with good health outcomes, but it hasn't really been connected to smiling, I think, because it's sort of a different behavior. But certainly both of them have cardiovascular effects. And certainly a lot of the time when people want to manipulate positive emotion in the lab, they do it by making people watch funny movies. And so a lot of the studies on positive emotion are kind of studying laughing without necessarily saying they're studying laughing. And certainly there's huge benefits from those kinds of studies as well. Great question. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think there are some people who don't smile in photographs because they think that you don't focus well when they do not smile. So is this self-image?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, for those of you who couldn't hear it, the reason that some people might not smile in photos is because they think they look better. So self-image-wise, they think they look better when they're not smiling versus when they're smiling. And I think that's definitely it. And so in the study that my student did with the health center visits, we still can't really figure out what drives that effect. And we wonder to what extent it is self-presentation. And so the kind of person who wants to present themselves in a certain way of smiling, that they're more likely to be the kind of person who goes to the doctor more often, because that's also kind of self-presentation in terms of self-care. But we didn't have a good measure of that. So I think that's possible. Other people have argued that, but this is, I don't think, relevant today because dental care is much better, but people have done work on people smiling in photos, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And one of the thoughts was that people didn't smile in photos before because their dental care wasn't always that good. And so that would actually be an indication of health, right? So if you're taking care of your teeth, you have money maybe, you can afford to do it. But I think now that's probably not the case at all. I think the more interesting thing is also cultural differences. So a lot of people, it's just not culturally the norm to smile. And so I think if we tried to do this in other countries, we might see completely different effects. But I think you kind of are getting at part of it, which is, how do we want to present ourselves? Do we want to present ourselves as this positive person? And that might have something to do with why, we see the doctor visit effect. Yeah?
How this is related to the big Amy Cuddy TED Talk on power positions.
Right, yeah, embodied cognition. Yeah, Amy Cuddy. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, how does this relate to the research on power posing, which is the idea that, if you act confident and look like Wonder Woman, that, you feel better. There's research showing that if you, take up more space and act, sort of put your body in sort of a confident position, it alters your testosterone levels, things like that. And so it's all part of the same package, actually. So it's a larger field called embodied cognition. And I think the physiological mechanism is different. It's a different pathway, but it's the same general concept, which is that when we do these things to our body, it's somehow our body is somehow trained to respond in a certain way to it. We don't know why our bodies evolved in such a way that when we smile, it reduces stress. You have to talk to an evolutionary psychologist. And there are reasons to think, why smiling might have, co-evolved with stress reduction. Things like smiling is a signal you could send to someone from very far away to tell them it's okay to come closer, and that it sort of encourages approach. And if you're going to encourage two people to kind of connect and meet each other, you probably wouldn't want them to be really stressed out. And so that would encourage maybe this sort of drop in heart rate, drop in arousal. It's all conjecture. We have no idea why our body does this. But I think it's the same idea with power poses, is that, maybe in the past our bodies, when someone was like in an aggressive position to fight, it would be good to have an activation of testosterone or, energy release, things like that. And so it's something about how our bodies have learned over time to respond in certain ways adaptively. It's very reflexive. So it's kind of, us trying to understand all the different ways we can trick our bodies into changing in certain ways, but definitely part of the same package. Good question. Yeah, Afton. Neuroendocrine? I don't think anyone's ever done that. So the question was, are there neuroendocrine differences between fake smiles and real smiles? So like cortisol or, no, I've never seen that done. You'd have to do it in sort of a trait way. Certainly, like if I just had you sit in a room, I can only have you smile for so long before your face gets tired and you get really annoyed at me. There's, like a 1 minute max, and even then your face starts hurting, which is related. There's actually one pretty famous business study that showed that in call centers, if you tell people to smile all day, they burn out. There's a max on this. So the only thing you could really do, because I think you couldn't get a cortisol effect or any kind of like epinephrine effect or anything like that by just having someone smile for a minute. And so I think you'd have to look dispositionally, like at photos, or like look at their Facebook photos or something and see if they're Duchenne smiling more, and then if that was correlated. But I think with that, you couldn't pull apart the effect of, is it just positive emotion, right? And so you'd have to almost design, and I've wanted to do this study, but where you maybe like have someone smile every hour, for a week, and then see if it changes their stress hormones. I think that would be cool, and you could potentially teach people to fake smile when you ask them to versus real smile, and see what happens. But it would be tricky because the one thing we've learned from doing this work is that people are not equally good at fake smiling. And like if you tell someone to do Duchenne smile, some people are really, really good at it, and they can just sincere smile like like when you ask them to. And other people, for example, people who are depressed, people who have autism, if you tell them to smile, they'll activate the wrong facial muscles. And so it's kind of a tricky problem to pull apart experimentally. But certainly correlationally, you could look at it with like trait smiling and see. It's a good question. Others? I think I have time for maybe a half question. Yeah. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I think there's a few things going on. So I think, one, I've talked to the author, to Strack, and I think that some people probably were Duchenne smiling in the original studies. They don't have videos of it, though. And so what my lab is doing right now is we're actually trying to track down the videos for these 17 studies to see whether or not some people were Duchenne smiling and some weren't, and if the ones who were Duchenne smiling, if you would see the effect. So that's one idea. But I think part of it, and there's some debate about this, is almost like a cohort effect. So in the early 1980s, most of you probably were like not born in this room. When the study was run, Far Side was kind of like the zeitgeist. It was like the cartoon that everyone loved. It was everyone's favorite cartoon. It was so funny. But I think that if you showed it to someone now, it might be like, haha, it's funny, like to like an 18-year-old, but it's not the same as when it was like the cartoon. And so I think to really run this study in a true replication, you almost need the equivalent zeitgeist. And so a lot of people in my lab were like, we need funny cat videos, you know, like something like that, like YouTube videos that people watch that, you know, and see if it works for that. And so they did do pre-testing of the Far Side cartoons, and people found them kind of like moderately funny, so they thought it was okay. But I really think you need to kind of pick something that's more like what people think is funny now and see if that would have the effect. So I think that's part of it. They also did it cross-culturally. So the first study was run, oh shoot, I actually don't know. Was the first study run in the US? I think it was. The studies this time were all over the world. And so I wonder if that's part of it too, that there's some cultural things going on.
Are there differences in generations?
Are there differences in generations with the smiling effects?
No, what they think is funny.
Oh, what they think is funny? Absolutely. Huge generational differences in what people think is funny.
So they normalized it for a certain age bracket when they did it.
So in both studies, they used essentially college student-aged people. Yeah. So yeah, yeah. Should I wrap it up? Okay. So I'll be around. Yeah.
Thank you. This is specially designed for guests who speak.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a little artifact. We always give artifacts. It's primarily, I think, Jane, didn't you create the artifact idea? We always have artifacts. Anyway, we're going to continue this in the hall in a little reception for as long as you want to stay, at least 5:30 probably for Sarah. You have a plane?
Yes,
later?
eventually.
Okay. Just by way of announcement, the next POSLinks speaker will not be in this room. It'll be exactly below us in room 1580, but in this building. General David Perkins, who's a Michigan alum. There are some people who believe that he is the single best Army general alive today. He was in charge for 5 years or so of the Training and Doctrine Command, which is the command in the U.S. Army that has to predict what kind of soldiers we want to adjust to the next 10 years. So he's out front trying to understand what in the world is going on in the world, how do we prepare for it, and he knows positive organization scholarship well. Many years ago, he was the commanding general at Fort Carson, Colorado. They were assigned to go close Iraq and clean it up. That's always harder than showing up in the first place. He had all of his senior leaders, maybe 100 of them, and their spouses for a full day exposed to positive practices, positive leadership, positive organization scholarship, in order to prepare to go to Iraq. I mean, what a guy this is. So he'll probably be the chief of staff of the Army, maybe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs next time around. So you'll want to hear Dave Perkins next time, which is February. It's November 2nd. Now, finally, and most importantly, we want to thank those who have sponsored this. Paul, where are you? I was right in front of me. Paul and Diane Jones, who have sponsored POSLinks for multiple years. Thanks so much to you. We appreciate you a lot. And this year, for the first time, the Tauber Institute, the Sanger Leadership Institute, the Zell Laurie Institute, and the Central, it's now called Michigan Learning and Professional Development. That used to be Michigan HR. So the University of Michigan is serious about sponsoring and supporting this kind of activity. So we want to thank them especially, and thank you, Paul and Diane. So, and thank you, Sarah. What happened to Sarah? You're wonderful. So we'll see you out here.